Rotten Johnny, the artist whose fury became art. The one who, in the late 1970s, shook the fundamental underpinnings of British society with the Sex Pistols. His contemporaries thought he was self-sufficient and worshipped no deities. However, despite his outward display of defiance, there were always hushed voices influencing his songwriting. And this is the moment when Rotten finally says their names when she's 69 years old. Legends that reflect his own life. Dark, bizarre, frightening souls, rather than the typical ones you might expect. Discover with us the 6 musicians who had an impact on him and why they were so important. Come on, we need to go. Hello, Nico. According to Johnny Rotten, Nico is the best. Indeed, what you heard was accurate. Hello, Nico. The man who would grow into punk's growling voice owes his entire musical identity to the mysterious chanteuse and solo artist of the Velvet Underground. The Marble Index, her solo album, was the catalyst for Rotten's discovery of her in a dingy London record store in 1974. The initial hearing was shocking. Dark, uncommercial, and totally out of step with the zeitgeist. That was the album. In a subsequent interview, Rotten acknowledged that her singing makes her sound dead, yet nevertheless more alive than everyone else. I have never heard a sound more sincere than that. Rotten heard the truth. Hard, unpolished, and fearless, where others had written her off as unapproachable. The way she transformed her anguish into art was so astounding that it went beyond simple adoration. Since Rotten's commitment was so different from his contemporaries, it was all the more surprising. Rotten said that Nico's voice served as his inspiration, even though many punk fans attributed it to American garage bands or New York's CBGB environment. For him, she embodied a more profound form of disobedience, a spirit-based revolt rather than a fad-based one. According to him, she was unapologetic about being hard to digest, never sought to be likable, and never compromised her vision. That unwavering bravery served as his model. He learned from Nico that music may be frightening, unsettling, and even alienating without sacrificing its fundamental authenticity. During the peak of the Sex Pistols, Rotten's fixation intensified. His obsession with the Marble Index would lead him to play it over and over again, this time dissecting its unsettling use of quiet and its stubborn resistance to resolution. Even on stage, such lessons were applicable. His aggressive pauses, rough vocal delivery, and defiance of the audience's approval all mirrored Nico's style. Despite the Guns' reputation as symbols of anarchy, Rotten subtly brought Nico's meticulous attention to detail to each show. Her tragic life piqued his interest even more. Tragically, Nico is away in 1988 following a bicycle accident in Ibiza. He battled heroin addiction, lost popularity, and died abruptly. Rotten found affirmation and caution in her narrative. It demonstrated both the enduring value of unwavering art and the terrible price of standing firm. Nico, in contrast to pop stars who go out of style, stayed immortal, eerie, and unforgettable. Perhaps since he had spent his entire thus opting for the more difficult path, Rotten had reverence for that sacrifice. When Rotten was 69 years old, Nico's impact had grown beyond mere melancholy. To him, it served as an ethical guide. True artists are defined not by popularity or sales, but by honesty, and he continues to hold her work in high esteem as evidence of this. He boldly contrasts the honesty and morality exhibited by Nico with his own choices, such as declining to reunite the Sex Pistols for financial gain. She served as a constant reminder to him that it is the artist's responsibility to challenge, not appease. You shouldn't be surprised to see Nico at the top of Johnny Rotten's unexpected list of favorite musicians. It reveals his artistic DNA to its fullest extent. He saw Nico as more than just a singer. For as long as anyone can remember, she was a role model for defiance, honesty, and unabashed individuality. Rotten Tomatoes ranks Neil Young, of all people, as number 2 on their list of startling people. Is that so? It is appropriate for you to be. He spit hatred at the establishment, yet he's devoted to a folk rocker from Canada? It's hard to believe. However, Neil Young exemplified, in Johnny Rotten's view, that genuine resistance could endure via ongoing innovation. His relationship with Neil Young began to take shape in the mid-1970s, at the peak of his own career. Rotten sought a more profound meaning in life, in contrast to his contemporaries who were enthralled by glam rock's glitz and glamour or the raw intensity of American garage bands. He discovered it in Tonight's the Night, an album composed by Young in 1975, a year following the tragic deaths of 2 of his closest friends due to drug overdoses. For the uninitiated, the album seemed disjointed and downbeat. However, Rotten perceived it as resonating with a harsh honesty, the type of unvarnished reality that he thought music was meant to convey. The fixation escalated from that point on. Rotten would play Tonight's the Night non-stop and claim, according to Sex Pistols guitarist Steve Jones, that he doesn't care if people enjoy his music. Just that one line described how deeply Rotten related to Young. At a time when most artists were trying to cash in on popularity, here was one who was prepared to turn off listeners if it meant staying true to himself. The discovery was revolutionary for Rotten. To rebel wasn't merely to make a racket. It centered on the courage to be unpopular. The fact that Young was always surprising Rotten was what really won him over. Unpredictably, Young went from folk ballads to heavy rock, electronic experiments to country diversion, all while bands like the Rolling Stones recycled basic riffs. It was this courageous growth that Rotten admired. When people believe they have Neil Young figured out, he switches gears, as he told Rolling Stone in 1980. That was bravery, not inconsistency, in Rotten's view. By destroying the map and choosing not to repeat steps, the artist was able to not just survive, but flourish. Even Rotten's professional decisions were influenced by this mentality. Record labels offered the Sex Pistols huge sums to get back together after the band broke up in 1978. The opportunity would have been seized by other bands. Undesired declined. The pinnacle of betrayal of punk spirit, in his view, would have been to replicate the handguns. He dove headfirst into loud noises, expansive melodies, and unexplored terrain instead, constructing a public image that was plundered. Instead of becoming a nostalgic act, he would rather to perplex and challenge, much like Young. He believed it was the only honest path, though it was a harder one. Rotten's admiration for Young grew as a result of his conflicts with the music industry. His own label sued Young in the 80s over records he had released that they felt were not commercially viable. That was the end of the road for most people's careers. It was bravery in Rotten's eyes. This artist was courageous enough to remain true to himself in the face of ridicule and financial catastrophe. It was reminiscent of the conflicts that Rotten had with managers, reporters, and fans, who insisted he continue playing Johnny Rotten's stereotypical role in perpetuity. The key to survival, as Young demonstrated, was not conformity but rebellion. The awe remains unwavering, even after all these years. Even at the age of 69, Rotten still uses Neil Young as an example to support his own choices. The author draws a comparison between Young and legendary rock acts that became nothing more than walking jukeboxes, playing their best hits during stadium tours without ever stopping. As a counterpoint, Young was always dismantling his own myths in order to construct replacement ones. Rotten held in the highest esteem that incessant wanderlust, that defiance of being ensnared by prosperity. Therefore, Neil Young is ranked second, and it's not for reasons having to do with politics or style, but with something more fundamental. He demonstrated to Rotten that resisting one's own desires for ease, variety, and quick cash is the most difficult form of resistance. Even at the age of 69, Rotten continues to use that lesson as a yardstick by which to evaluate his own decisions. Van der Graaf. Thirdly, the most surprising choice, Graaf Generator, was Rotten's. A complicated and theatrical progressive rock band, the very type of music that punk was meant to dismantle. But Johnny Rotten saw no reason for them to be adversaries. But true love, indulgence in their labor was not heard by him. A sophisticated masking of primal emotion reached his ears. In 1975, while attending a friend's house party, Rotten made his discovery. He stood motionless as the album Pawn Hearts played, while everyone else chatted and drank. Intricate, disorganized, and monumental, the music was a maze. However, the piercing, frantic, and somewhat insane voice of Peter Hamill soon entered the scene. That man screams like he's about to die, but he's doing it over these amazing musical landscapes, Rotten said afterwards. Classical strength meets punk emotion. That expression explains it all. According to Rotten, Graaf Generator demonstrated that intricacy could sustain intensity, rather than limiting it to 3 chords and a sneer. Rotten felt that the raw honesty driving each note was more appealing than the band's technical fireworks. In an effort to wow listeners, several prog bands in the 1970s played lengthy solos after solos. The generators of der Graaf were unique. They were never sterile in their accuracy. A release of pent-up energy, it was intense and ferocious. Beautiful violence, according to Rotten, was the music that turned wrath and truth into beauty. This was like entering a whole new universe for a troubled adolescent who was looking for a voice to express his feelings. There was an immediate impact. Despite the little rain that fell from the gun, Rotten's stage presence still had elements of Hamill's dramatic performance. He analyzed Hamill's syllable-stretching techniques, dynamics, and the way his fragility amplified the anger. Peter Hamill taught me that you can be clever and still absolutely raw, Rotten told Melody Maker in 1978. He carried this lesson with him throughout his life, but it was particularly important during his experimental years when his public image was under attack. Critics said that Rotten betrayed punk when he and Peel adopted longer tracks and unusual formations. However, he perceived this as the essence of punk, defying categorization. He learned from the Graaf Generator that intelligence amplified the dangers of music, not diminished them. In defense of his prog sympathies against the most extreme punks, he said that complexity with honesty may sting even more than meaninglessness without feeling. It was a move that baffled some listeners, but showcased his creative range as a musician. Whether it was punk or mainstream music, Graaf Generator played to Rotten's desire to rebel against authority. His perception of Hamill and his band was that of outcasts, making music that defied categorization but was nonetheless profoundly influential. Rotten saw other pilgrims and artists prepared to alienate fans in order to speak their truths in them. Rotten, who is now 69 years old and still going strong, cites Graaf Generator as evidence that punk and prog were actually comrades rather than enemies. Both were responses to boring commercial rock, aimed to challenge listeners and prioritize truth over acceptability. Rotten found Hamill's frantic cry to be just as punk as anything he had done before involving the weapons. It is not irony or a joke that Johnny Rotten ranks the Graaf Generator third. It serves as a timely reminder that the most startling influences frequently transcend barriers we believed were impenetrable. Prog wasn't an adversary to him. Even a figure as complicated and dramatic as Peter Hamill's may be a mask of revolt. Perry Lee Scratch. Fourth on the list is Johnny Rotten, who whisks us away from the dreary streets of London and into the smoky studios of Kingston, Jamaica. He goes with the eccentric producer Lee Scratch Perry, who developed dub music as if he were a mad scientist and flipped reggae on its head. Rotten saw Perry as more than just a musician. He demonstrated how the studio may function as a tool for subversion. In the middle of the 1970s, Rotten was at a Notting Hill apartment when she first heard Perry's music. Rotten became engrossed when a buddy of Perry's accidentally dropped the needle on one of his dub efforts. Echo, reverb, and noises that seemed to squash in on themselves filled the area rather than well-executed production. Rotten went on to say that this individual is completely flipping the script on music. He is doing more than simply breaking records. He is constructing entirely new worlds. That expression sums up his fascination with Perry. By dismantling every rule of traditional music, he was creating new realms of sound. When it came to Rotten, Perry spoke for freedom on a grander scale than anybody else. When Perry was in the studio, she was violating musical rules, just as punk was about breaking social norms on stage. Perry welcomed distortion, errors, and audio accidents, in contrast to other producers who sought clarity and perfection. Controlled chaos was his term. The fact that Perry could bring order out of disorder was something that Rotten greatly liked. It proved that revolt didn't necessarily need to be violent or overt. It could be quiet, experimental, and terrifying to the powerful nonetheless. Lootered, Rotten's later work on public image revealed the impact. There were fingerprints all over the place. In the spatialization of sound as much as the oral one, in the surprising placement of instruments in the mix, and in the extensive use of echo. By assimilating these methods, Rotten created something entirely new. His discussions with Perry revealed his realization that quiet may be just as impactful as loudness. While not many punk bands adopted this lesson, Rotten did. Even though Perry's attempts were frequently panned by critics for being too lavish or confusing, Rotten fiercely defended him. Scratch Perry demonstrates that the best art comes from the edge of sanity. He told Black Music magazine once. Rotten didn't take offense to this. Such adulation was unparalleled. It indicated that Perry was brave enough to venture into uncharted creative area, to straddle the fine line between genius and lunacy. Rotten could relate to that spirit because he, too, felt like an outcast. In their pursuit of novelty, both men were prepared to take the chance of being misunderstood. The fact that Perry would not play by anyone's rules further added to his significance in Rotten's eyes. Not his own, not pop, not even reggae. He continued to reinvent himself despite destroying relationships, and even his own studio. Being an outsider gave Rotten a sense of belonging. Rotten, like Perry, was not going to be confined by punk orthodoxy. They both showed that overthrowing the government is just the beginning of the fight for freedom. It keeps going because it won't do what you expect it to. At the age of 69, Rotten is still in awe of Perry, even after all these years. The skills he learned from dub, like as incorporating the studio into his music, embracing turmoil as an artistic catalyst, and utilizing silence as an instrument, persisted in his creative DNA. He frequently made the observation that Perry exemplified a new sort of resistance, one that sought transformation rather than devastation. Therefore, it is not a matter of taste or trendiness that Johnny Rotten ranks Lee Scratching Perry at number 4. It's about paying homage to a prophet who showed him that chaos, stillness, and echoes may be the foundation of a rebellion. Perry played a larger role than that of producer for Rotten. He foretold the future of music. His wild imagination continues to influence Rotten's musical sensibilities and productions. Scott Walker is the guy. Scott Walker comes in at number 5 on Johnny Rotten's list, which continues to surprise fans who only think of Rotten in terms of punk rage. As a member of the Walker brothers, Walker first gained fame as a teenage hero when they performed rich pop ballads to adoring audiences. Rotten loved Walker in a different version. In the face of record labels' fears and his audience's confusion, Walker dove headfirst into darker, more experimental music, which is where his respect for him began. On the strength of a suggestion from a local record store, he first heard Walker's solo recordings in 1976. Rotten was captivated by Walker's latter work, Stranger Work, even though many still remembered him for classics like The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore. This is a man who consciously chose to live a life of obscurity in order to create work that would never compromise, rejecting the lure of commercial success. That was the most extreme type of defiance, in Rotten's view. Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren claims that Rotten developed an unhealthy preoccupation with the metamorphosis. Incredulous, he informed McLaren that he had gone from teen idol to total creative lunatic. Putting your own success at risk in pursuit of truth is a real punk move. That statement shows that, for Rotten, being genuine meant being prepared to destroy everything in pursuit of truth rather than being popular. He wanted to make a daring leap like the one he saw in Walker's journey. The emotional risk was where Walker's music really shone for Rotten. Grand orchestral nightmares were the sound of Walker's later albums, in contrast to polished pop and predictable rock, horrifying and brimming with an otherworldly charm. Scott Walker taught me that true rebellion is giving up on what makes you popular, as Rotten stated once. That phrase clarifies why Rotten felt such a strong connection to him. The bravery required to separate oneself from one's own fan base in pursuit of artistic growth was something he respected, in addition to the sound. Even during his post-punk years, when his public image was in a state of flux, the influence seeped into Rotten's own work. Much of his courage to use discordant textures, unique vocal methods, and dramatic arrangements came from seeing Walker. Rotten, according to his bandmates, would practice stretching an emotion across a single line until it became intolerable by studying Walker's dramatic phrasing. Rather than mimicking, he was taking notes on how to emphasize feelings without sacrificing accuracy. Critics were perplexed by Walker's change, and fans were enraged because they wanted their former teen idol back. Rotten fought vehemently in his defense. He maintained that Walker's bravery warranted admiration, not scorn, because it was the hardest choice any musician could make to prioritize art over easy money. Artistry isn't about winning over spectators, as Rotten discovered in Walker. The lesson was to always tell the truth, no matter the consequences. His admiration for Walker had only grown by the time Rotten had reached the age of 69. He frequently used Walker as an example to back up his own erratic professional decisions. Rotten, following Walker's lead, eschewed the security of routine. Constantly reinventing oneself was his solemn belief in the way to integrity, even though he, too, ran the danger of being labeled as difficult or irrelevant. He learned from Walker that evolution is a necessity, not a luxury. Beefheart, the captain. Now we reach number 6. Johnny Rotten consults Captain Beefheart, one of the most eccentric and demanding musicians of the 20th century. Don Van Vliet's albums were across as disorganized, unintelligible, and even ridiculous to the majority of listeners. But they were revelations to Rotten. Art without conciliation, apology, or even a passing interest in approbation was exemplified by Beefheart, who stood for the highest expression of defiance. When Rotten first laid eyes on the iconic Trout Mask copy in the mid-1970s, his fascination began. It was 40 minutes of disorientation for the uninitiated, with erratic rhythms, guitars, and voices that sounded like spoken word crashing with blues. Rotten saw it as evidence that music could break all the rules and yet have an impact. "This is what real rebellion sounds like," he would say to his buddies as he played the song nonstop, disregarding all musical norms and regulations. That remark encapsulated his greatest admiration: complete autonomy. Beefheart created music that existed in a parallel realm, setting him apart from other artists who were after record deals and radio play. This was liberation, not noise, to Rotten. He looked up to Beefheart for his honest music that defied pop and rock conventions. While his peers were busy trying to break into the entertainment industry, Beefheart seemed satisfied to stay on the outside. Rotten informed NME in 1977 that, as real revolt entails smashing expectations rather than merely breaking them, Don Van Vliet recognized this. Beefheart wasn't strange to him. He embodied the very essence of creative integrity. He was the genuine article. The impact wasn't confined to theory. With public image low-lighted, it appeared in Rotten's work. He took design cues from Beefheart's erratic rhythms, rough vocal delivery, and fearlessness in experimenting with unsettling musical territory. Rotten viewed it as carrying on a tradition that Beefheart had started, while critics might have written it off as indulgent. Art, just because it is art, regardless of the number of bewildered viewers. Rotten held Beefheart in high esteem in part because of the honesty with which he made decisions. While continuing to play the commercial game, several musicians toyed with insurrection. Never did Beefheart bother. Only what pleased him was captured in his paintings, writings, and recordings. Because of his unwavering integrity, Rotten saw him as an elusive, irreplaceable person. Beefheart proved that one could endure without caving in, which was a relief for Rotten, who had spent his career battling managers, record labels, and even fans. Rotten continued to defend Beefheart against reviewers who said his recordings were unlistenable for decades. The idea, he said, was that it was tough. We didn't create music to make it easier. Its intended effect was to shock, unsettle, and provoke. There was an intellectual as well as an emotional rebellion in Beefheart's music, according to Rotten. What gave them their potency was their demand for active listening. Even now, at the age of 69, Rotten considers Beefheart a pivotal character in his life. He brought a lesson that was brutally straightforward. The sacrifices you make for art and honesty will be worth it in the end. Frequently, he drew comparisons between Beefheart and commercial performers who became wealthy but failed to make a lasting impact. Punks, experimentalists, and anyone who thought art should never succumb to commercialism were all influenced by Beefheart's legacy, notwithstanding how misunderstood he was. Consequently, Johnny Rotten's reaction upon adding Captain Beefheart to his list is one of recognition rather than horror. He admired Don Van Vliet for having the guts to be himself, to put himself out there, and to build an uncompromising body. The greatest of all was that Johnny Rotten was influenced by such musicians. No one anticipated Neil's reimagination of Go's eerie voice. From the stunning work of Scott Walker to the raw artwork of Captain Beefheart, Vandergraaf created the Lee Perry Mayhem. They are all members of the most notorious punk band. The man who spit on the music and shouted, "No future," is shocking. There are some of the most intricate and talented people in his universe. From these 6 names, it is now your turn.